The fourth episode for the old Atari 2600 starts off with my favorite classic-style shoot-'em-up from my collection, Demon Attack, released by iMagic in 1982. It's one of the first games that was recommended to me when I started digging into the Atari 2600 catalog many years ago, and it's also one of the first games that I eventually bought for my own Atari. Of course, there's a certain amount of Space Invaders and Galaxian in this game, but the random manner of the demon birds flying and their varied styles of shooting at you makes it a surprisingly exciting game for a single-screen shooter anyway. It took me a while to realize, but there's never more than one demon bird from the flock that actually shoots at you, so that's a trick worth exploiting. However, the randomness of the bird's movement and their gradual speed up is not something to be overlooked as threats. Although Demon Attack is, at least for me, one of the best single-screen space shooters of all time, it was also one of the first video games to get a lawsuit for being too similar to another game, this being Taito's Phoenix from 1980, the home video game port rights for which Atari had bought the license. Well, as the story goes, the case was settled out of court and Demon Attack became iMagic's biggest selling game. Our second game for today was already featured as the topic of one of my Let's Play videos a while ago, Kangaroo by Atari 1983. Kangaroo is a Donkey Kong clone of sorts, but to be honest, I'm so sick and tired of the classic Donkey Kong due to it being available on every possible 8-bit platform, none of which are particularly interesting for me, so a good clone with something unique going on for it can be more interesting. Of course, if you saw my previous episode on the 8-bit Atari computers, you would have heard this already. Although Kangaroo didn't appear in my radar until a couple of years after emulation came along, it did strike me as odd that while it didn't look like much, some people commenting on the game seemed to be oddly enthusiastic about it. So this must have been around 2001. I checked it out myself and found it underwhelming at first. After a couple of more plays, I realized there were some elements in Kangaroo that made it more interesting to play than Donkey Kong, even though in graphical design it was nowhere near Donkey Kong. Of course, you can jump and climb with your Kangaroo just like you can with a Mario-like man in Donkey Kong, but here you can actually do some active defensive actions against the onslaught of angry monkeys by punching them after they enter a branch of the tree they climb down from. You can also crouch, which must have been a pretty new feature in such a game back then. Come to think of it, BC's Quest for Tires from the same year also has crouch, but I can't say which game was released first. Leave a comment if you know more about it. Anyway, as I demonstrated to my surprise in the aforementioned Let's Play video, Kangaroo only has 3 levels, after which the game loops from the beginning with a higher level of difficulty. It's simple but fun, and certainly a great option for the more classic Donkey Kong. I might have mentioned Activision's Atari 2600 Action Pack compilations in an earlier episode, but if I have, I'm going to mention them again, because those compilations were my first exposure to Atari 2600 games since Pac-Man on my uncle's Atari around 1984-85. I have chosen 3 more games from the compilations for this episode, starting with a game that I recognize as part of DuckTales: The Quest for Gold, Barnstorming from 1982. The connection to that DuckTales game I mentioned is, when you travel to any point in the map, you control a biplane through the air with possibility to fly through open-ended barns for some extra cash, and otherwise you needed to avoid getting hit by anything else. The same thing goes for Barnstorming, except it's obviously a bit simpler in design. The ground level is only occupied by barns and windmills, all of which are, according to an instructional video from 1982, designed to appear in a specific order for each specific level. Also, the geese flying above the barns and windmills have their own patterns. For completing a level, you need to pass through a set number of barns within the given time limit. Crashing into anything will only lose your speed, but when you fail to finish the goal, it's game over. In all its simplicity, Barnstorming is a nice and addicting little time waster, which should be part of any Atari gamer's collection. Along with Pressure Cooker, Enduro and Keystone Capers, one of my favorite Activision games in an alternating order is Private Eye from 1984. I've always been a sucker for sleuthing games, even when they're not particularly good, and Private Eye just about dances around the edges of badness, although that's because there's only so much depth you can expect from an Atari 2600 game. But if, for some reason, the creator, Bob Whitehead, or any other old Activision personnel is watching this, dancing around the edges of badness is something I consider a good thing. Private Eye plays excellently, there's no question of that. The method of sleuthing is more than a bit unorthodox, however, since all you do is drive around town in your car, jump over a variety of obstacles, most of which are either oil puddles or animals, and try to find clues and treasures from crooks peeking through windows which you need to pick up, again by jumping. The cool thing about Private Eye is that there are 5 cases to play, all of which require you to perform different tasks. The first 2 cases take place within an area of 32 blocks, and you need to find 2 things and take them to certain locations: gun to the gun store, money back to the bank, and so forth, before eventually finding Le Fiend and booking him at the police headquarters. The time limit for the first 2 cases is very low, and the bigger the case you take on, the more area to search and the more time you have to complete your mission. Although not absolutely necessary, the game's manual and map are good to have been read to understand your missions properly, and to have at least some idea where to find all the things you need. Private Eye is a fun and challenging game, and a unique one at that, and for me, it's one of those games that got me convinced I should get myself an Atari 2600. Alas, the game is still missing from my collection, but thankfully I got a modern SD card reader solution to make up for that inconvenience. For the last entry today, I wanted to include one of the first cartridges that I purchased for my own Atari 2600, which, I grant you, didn't happen all that long ago, so I don't even have any nostalgia for it as such, but I found this 4 games in 1 cartridge, apparently from Bit Corporation, so funny and strange in its design that I automatically liked it, despite the games within being mostly less than impressive. Since this was a product in 1983, and one quite clearly unofficial at that, the games included are not particularly high profile, apart from maybe one, and instead of a startup menu, the games have to be chosen by flicking a couple of switches on the cartridge itself before booting up your Atari. Awkward, but hey, it's 1983. The first game listed is Rodeo Champ, which for some reason I have always had the most trouble getting to work. It's nothing more than a version of Activision's Stampede, with the game title and Activision logo hacked out of sight. Well, this being the 3rd Activision game from the aforementioned compilation packs, and since I'm also not going to feature this game elsewhere, I might as well elaborate. That is a side-scrolling arcade game in which you have to lasso up as many running and bystanding cattle as you can, and the game is over when you have missed 3 of them. Bumping into running cattle makes them take a quick sprint ahead to the edge of the screen. Reasonably fun, but gets repetitive immediately. Open Sesame boots up to a title screen with a speech sample, and is otherwise a fairly simple variant of Donkey Kong's first screen, in which you need to extend all the ropes to platforms above and reach the weird-looking item at the top of the room. Once you do, the game becomes more difficult. You can pick up bouncing square power-ups on your way, which enable you to knock down one of the roaming enemies for a while upon contact. Again, it gets repetitive very quickly, but not too bad. Possibly the most replayable game from the cartridge is a flip-screen platformer called Bobby is Going Home. The closest equivalent I can think of this game is that Johnny or Snoopy game from Radarsoft, which I featured on a C64 Nostalgia Trip episode some time ago. You just need to avoid everything and jump over gaps and eventually reach home. There are a few difficulty levels to choose from, but ultimately it's another simple game that loses interest fairly quickly. The only potentially interesting thing about Bobby is Going Home is the amount of background graphics built in, which is unusual to see on an Atari 2600 game. The last one is a shooting gallery game called Festival, which actually is Coleco's port of Sega's arcade classic Carnival. It's not a bad game as such if you're into these sorts of games, and it serves a good purpose of bringing some real diversity to this cartridge. For an unofficial 4-game compilation cartridge from 1983, it's a decent one, and it's a nice curiosity to have in my collection. Perhaps in time, Bobby is Going Home might be the one game to have further revisits. Who knows?